the sound of gunfire echoing through the streets of Wasco, Oregon Territory, had become as common as birdsong by the summer of 1883. But Eleanor Crawford barely flinched anymore as she sat beneath the sprawling oak tree at the edge of town, her eyes fixed on the pages before her. She had learned to distinguish between the sharp crack of a warning shot and the duller thud of genuine violence, and this particular afternoon seemed blessedly quiet, despite the occasional reminder that civilization here was still more aspiration than reality. The book in her hands was a worn copy of Charles Dickens, its spine cracked from repeated readings, and she had claimed this spot as her sanctuary ever since arriving in Wasco 3 months ago to help her aunt run the general store. The shadow fell across her page just as she reached a particularly moving passage, and Eleanor looked up to find a tall man standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. His clothes were dusty from travel, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held an unexpected gentleness that caught her off guard. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she estimated, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a lean build that spoke of long days in the saddle. "I apologize for the interruption, miss," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested origins further south. "I could not help but notice you sitting here, and I was curious about what book could hold someone so completely captivated that they would not notice a stranger approaching." Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck, partly from embarrassment at being caught so unaware and partly from the directness of his gaze. "It is Great Expectations," she replied, holding up the book so he could see the cover. "I have read it before, but some stories deserve to be visited again." The man's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his entire countenance. "Charles Dickens," he said with obvious pleasure. "I have not met many folks out here who appreciate fine literature. Most people seem to think reading is a waste of time when there is work to be done." He glanced around as if seeking permission before asking, "Would you mind terribly if I sat for a moment? I have been riding since dawn, and the prospect of discussing a good book is more appealing than another whiskey at the saloon." She hesitated only briefly before gesturing to the grass beside her. "Please sit, though I should warn you that once I start talking about books, I tend to lose track of time entirely." "That sounds like exactly what I need," he said, settling onto the ground with the easy grace of someone accustomed to sleeping under stars and making camp in wild places. "My name is Yates Turner, though most people just call me Yates. I am passing through on my way to deliver a herd of horses to a ranch up north, but my men are handling the animals for the afternoon, and I found myself with a few hours of freedom." "Eleanor Crawford," she responded, closing the book but keeping one finger between the pages to mark her place. "I came here from Massachusetts to help my Aunt Martha with her store. She hurt her back last spring and needed someone to assist with the heavy lifting and inventory." Yates settled back against the tree trunk, stretching his long legs out before him. "Massachusetts to Oregon Territory is quite a journey. Do you miss it, the East?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I miss certain things. The libraries, the theaters, the feeling that culture and civilization are close at hand. But there is something about this place that calls to me as well. The vastness of it, the sense that anything is possible. Back home, every path seemed already worn smooth by the footsteps of those who came before. Here, you can still make your own way." "That is poetry right there," Yates said softly. "You have a way with words yourself, Miss Crawford. Have you ever thought about writing?" The question surprised her because it touched on a secret dream she had shared with almost no one. "I keep a journal," she admitted. "And sometimes I write little stories, though I have never shown them to anyone. It seems presumptuous to think my words would interest others." I would wager they would, Yates said with conviction. Anyone who can articulate thoughts the way you just did has something worth saying. He nodded toward the book in her hands. So what draws you back to Great Expectations? What makes it worth a second reading? Eleanor opened the book again, running her fingers over the worn pages. I suppose it is the theme of becoming someone better than you were, of rising above your circumstances without losing the essential parts of yourself. Pip struggles so much with wanting to be a gentleman while also feeling guilty about leaving his humble origins behind. I find that conflict very human and very real. Yates was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I understand that particular struggle more than you might think. I was raised on a small ranch in Texas. Nothing fancy, but my mother insisted that my brother and I learn to read and appreciate literature. She had been a school teacher before she married my father, and she believed that a person could work with their hands and still feed their mind. When she died, I was 16, and I almost let that part of myself die with her. It seemed easier to just be a cowboy, to live simply and not think too deeply about things. What changed? Eleanor asked gently, sensing the weight of memory in his words. I found a copy of Ivanhoe in an abandoned line shack one winter when I was 19, Yates said with a slight smile. I was snowed in for 3 days with nothing but that book and a dwindling supply of jerky. By the time the storm cleared, I had remembered how much I loved getting lost in a story, how it made me feel connected to something larger than my own small existence. I started collecting books whenever I could, carrying them in my saddlebags, reading by firelight when the rest of the men were sleeping or playing cards. They teased me about it at first, but eventually they got used to my peculiarity. Eleanor found herself warming to this unexpected cowboy with his love of literature and his easy manner of speaking. What else do you carry in those saddlebags? What other treasures have you collected? Yates laughed, a rich sound that seemed to rumble up from deep in his chest. Let me see. I have got a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, though the binding is falling apart. A collection of Edgar Allan Poe stories that I bought in San Francisco 2 years ago. Some Walt Whitman poetry that I am still not entirely sure I understand, but that moves me nonetheless. And a rather battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo that has seen me through many a lonely night. The Count of Monte Cristo, Eleanor breathed. That is one of my absolute favorites. The scope of it, the patience of Edmond Dantes, the way justice is finally served even though the path is so long and difficult. Exactly, Yates said, leaning forward with enthusiasm. And the complexity of his revenge, how it is both satisfying and troubling at the same time. You find yourself cheering for him while also wondering if he has lost too much of his humanity in his quest for vengeance. They fell into an animated discussion of Alexander Dumas, comparing his various works and debating the merits of The Three Musketeers versus The Count of Monte Cristo. Eleanor felt a kind of joy she had not experienced since leaving Massachusetts, the pure pleasure of connecting with someone over shared passions. The conversation flowed naturally from Dumas to Victor Hugo, from there to the Bronte sisters, and then to a spirited debate about whether American literature could truly compare to its European counterparts. I would argue that we have our own unique voice emerging, Eleanor insisted. Look at Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, even the poetry of Emily Dickinson, though she is not widely known yet. There is something distinctly American in their work, a questioning of established order, a darkness that comes from our particular history. Yates nodded thoughtfully. You make a compelling case. I confess I have read more European literature than American, partly because that is what my mother had in her collection, and partly because those were the books most readily available in the places I have traveled. but I am intrigued by your passion for it. Perhaps you could recommend some titles I should seek out. I would be happy to, Eleanor said, and then surprised herself by adding, I have several books with me that I brought from Massachusetts. If you are staying in Wasco for a few days, you would be welcome to borrow one. I would like that very much, Yates said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip slightly. I am planning to stay at least through the end of the week. The horses need rest, and frankly, so do I. It has been a long drive from southern Oregon. The sun had shifted considerably during their conversation, and Eleanor realized with a start that several hours had passed. She had completely lost track of time, just as she had warned him might happen. Goodness, I should be getting back to the store. My aunt will wonder what happened to me. Yates rose smoothly to his feet and offered her his hand to help her up. His palm was calloused, but his grip was gentle, and Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her stomach at the contact. Might I walk you back to town? He asked. I would like to continue our conversation if you are willing, and I should probably check on my men anyway to make sure they have not gotten into any trouble. They walked together through the dusty streets of Wasco, their conversation continuing to flow easily. Eleanor found herself noticing small details about him. The way he touched his hat brim when they passed other women on the street, his courteous manner of positioning himself between her and the rougher elements that loitered outside the saloons, the genuine interest he showed when she pointed out various landmarks and told him about the town's brief history. Wasco is not much to look at yet, she admitted, but it is growing. The railroad is supposed to come through eventually, and there is talk of establishing better roads to connect us with Portland and the other settlements. My aunt believes this will be an important town someday. Your aunt sounds like a woman of vision, Yates observed. It takes courage to see potential where others only see hardship. They reached the general store, a sturdy building with a false front that made it look larger than it actually was. Through the window, Eleanor could see her Aunt Martha moving slowly behind the counter, her movements still careful because of her injured back. This is where I live, Eleanor said, feeling oddly reluctant to end their time together. We have rooms above the store. Yates glanced at the building and then back at Eleanor. Would it be too forward of me to ask if I might call on you tomorrow? Perhaps we could continue our literary discussion, and you could show me some of those American authors you recommended. Eleanor felt a smile spreading across her face. I would like that. Tomorrow is Sunday and the store is closed except for the morning. I usually spend my afternoons reading under that same tree. You would be welcome to join me. Then I will see you tomorrow afternoon, Yates said, his own smile matching hers. Thank you for one of the most pleasant afternoons I have had in a very long time, Miss Crawford. It is not often I meet someone who can discuss Dickens with such insight. The pleasure was mine, Mr. Turner, she replied, and meant it sincerely. She watched him walk away, his long strides carrying him down the street toward the livery where he had presumably stabled his horse. Only when he disappeared from view did she turn and enter the store, where her aunt was regarding her with undisguised curiosity. Martha Crawford was a sturdy woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed very little. "Who was that handsome young man walking you home?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was more amused than disapproving. "His name is Yates Turner," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice casual as she moved behind the counter to help sort through a delivery of dry goods. "He is passing through with a horse herd, and we happened to strike up a conversation about books." "Books," Martha repeated with obvious skepticism. "That conversation about books certainly put some color in your cheeks and a sparkle in your eyes." Eleanor felt herself blushing again. "He is simply an interesting person to talk to, Aunt Martha." It is rare to find someone out here who appreciates literature. Hum, her aunt said, but she was smiling. Well, interesting or not, you be careful. Cowboys are not known for putting down roots, and you have already had your heart bruised once. I would not want to see it happen again. The reference to her broken engagement back in Massachusetts stung slightly, but Eleanor knew her aunt meant well. Robert Harrison had seemed like everything she wanted: educated, established from a good family. But he had also wanted a wife who would be content to host dinner parties and manage his household, who would give up her own dreams and ambitions to support his. When she had suggested that she might continue writing even after marriage, perhaps even try to publish some of her work, he had laughed and told her that no wife of his would embarrass him by seeking public attention. The engagement had ended shortly after, much to the disappointment of both their families. "I am not looking for a husband, Aunt Martha," Eleanor said firmly. "I am simply enjoying a conversation with someone who shares my interests. There is no harm in that." "No harm at all," her aunt agreed. "Just keep your eyes open along with your heart." That evening, Eleanor found it difficult to concentrate on anything. She helped close up the store, prepared dinner for herself and her aunt, and went through all her usual routines, but her mind kept drifting back to Yates Turner and their conversation beneath the oak tree. She found herself analyzing every word they had exchanged, looking for deeper meaning, and then scolding herself for acting like a silly schoolgirl. In her room that night, she pulled out her journal and tried to capture her feelings on paper. Writing had always been her way of processing emotions, of making sense of the chaos of human experience. She described the way Yates had looked when he talked about his mother, the passion in his voice when he discussed literature, the gentle strength in his hands when he helped her to her feet. She wrote about the unexpected connection she had felt, the sense of meeting someone who understood a fundamental part of her that most people never saw. But she also wrote about her fears. What if this was simply a pleasant interlude, a moment out of time that would end when he rode north with his horses? What if she was projecting qualities onto him that he did not actually possess, seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was really there? And perhaps most troubling, what if she opened her heart again, only to discover that he, like Robert, could not accept all of who she was? Sleep came slowly that night, and when it finally did, Eleanor dreamed of endless roads and distant horizons, of conversations that lasted until stars filled the sky, of a man with kind eyes who saw her not as she should be, but as she truly was. The next morning dawned clear and warm, promising another beautiful summer day. Eleanor attended church with her aunt, barely hearing the sermon as her mind wandered to the afternoon ahead. After services, several of the town's matrons approached to inquire about Martha's health and to welcome Eleanor again, though she had been in Wasco for 3 months now. She answered their questions politely, accepted their invitations to various social gatherings, and tried not to watch the door for a tall figure in dusty cowboy clothes. Yates was not at church, which did not particularly surprise her. Many of the working men in town did not attend services regularly, and cowboys especially tended to view religion as something optional. Still, she felt a small twinge of disappointment that was entirely unreasonable given that they had made plans for the afternoon, not the morning. After a light lunch, Eleanor selected 3 books from her small collection: a volume of Nathaniel Hawthorne's short stories, a copy of Moby Dick that she had read twice and still found somewhat bewildering, and a slim book of Walt Whitman's poetry that had been given to her by her favorite teacher. She wrapped them carefully in cloth to protect them from dust and made her way to the oak tree, her heart beating faster than the walk warranted. Yates was already there, sitting on a blanket he had spread beneath the tree's shade. He rose immediately when he saw her approaching, a broad smile crossing his face. "Miss Crawford," he said warmly, "I was hoping I had the right day and time. I have been looking forward to this all morning." "As have I," Eleanor admitted, settling onto the blanket beside him. "I brought some books I thought you might enjoy." She unwrapped the volumes and explained a bit about each one. Yates listened intently, picking up each book with a reverence that touched her. When she handed him the Whitman poetry, he opened it carefully and read a few lines, his lips moving silently as he absorbed the words. "This is extraordinary," he said after a moment. "The freedom of it, the way he breaks all the conventional rules of poetry and yet creates something so powerful. Listen to this. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." There is such confidence in those lines, such a radical vision of equality and connection. Eleanor felt a thrill of pleasure at his immediate understanding of what made Whitman special. Exactly. He sees the divine in the everyday, the sacred in the common. Some people find his work scandalous, too frank in its physicality and too unconventional in its form. But I think he is trying to capture the essential truth of American life, the democracy not just of our politics, but of our very souls. They spent the next hour discussing Whitman, reading passages aloud to each other and debating interpretations. Yates had a natural feeling for poetry, an instinct for rhythm and meaning that surprised Eleanor given his lack of formal education. When she mentioned this, he shrugged modestly. "My mother used to say that education and intelligence are not the same thing," he said. She believed that anyone willing to think deeply and question assumptions could understand great literature, regardless of how many years they spent in a schoolhouse. I suppose I have always taken her at her word. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Eleanor said softly. She was. Yates was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the poetry book. "She died of fever when I was 16, and my father followed her less than a year later. I think he died of a broken heart more than anything else. They had that kind of love, the kind that makes two people into something greater than either could be alone." "That is beautiful and sad at the same time," Eleanor said. "It is," Yates agreed. "But I have always been grateful that I got to witness that kind of love, even if I lost it too soon. It showed me what is possible between two people when they truly understand and accept each other." Eleanor felt the weight of those words, the implication that he was looking for something similar in his own life. She found herself wanting to ask more, to delve into his past and his hopes for the future, but something held her back. They had only just met, after all. There would be time for deeper conversations if this connection proved to be more than a fleeting encounter. Instead, she asked about his work, and Yates described the life of a cowboy with vivid detail. He talked about long cattle drives through difficult terrain, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about the camaraderie that developed among men who depended on each other for survival. But he also spoke honestly about the hardships, the loneliness of being constantly on the move, the danger from weather and animals and occasionally from other men, the difficulty of building any kind of permanent life when your home was wherever you happened to be at the moment. "I have been thinking lately that I might want something different," he admitted. "I am 27 now, and while I love the freedom of the open range, I also find myself wondering what it would be like to have a place of my own, to build something lasting instead of always moving on to the next job." "What is stopping you?" Eleanor asked. Yates considered the question. "Partly money. It takes capital to buy land and stock it properly. I have been saving, but I am not quite there yet, and partly, I suppose, it is fear." The only life I have really known since my parents died is this wandering one. Settling down would mean taking a risk, betting on a future that might not turn out the way I hope. All worthwhile things require risk, Eleanor observed. Staying safe means staying still, and staying still means never growing into who you could become. He looked at her with such intensity that she felt her breath catch. You have a wisdom beyond your years, Miss Crawford. How old are you, if you do not mind my asking? 23, she replied. Old enough to have made some mistakes and learned from them, young enough to still believe in possibilities. 23, he repeated. A good age. You have time to build the life you want. As do you, she pointed out. They talked through the afternoon, the conversation ranging across countless topics. Yates told her about places he had seen. The red rock canyons of Arizona Territory, the vast grasslands of Montana, the wild beauty of the California coast. Eleanor described life in Massachusetts, the changing seasons that Oregon did not quite replicate, the tight-knit society that could be both comforting and suffocating, depending on your perspective. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, Yates suddenly said, I have a confession to make. When I saw you sitting here yesterday, it was not really the book that caught my attention first. It was you. The way you were so absorbed, so completely present in whatever world those pages contained. I made up the excuse about being curious about the book because I wanted a reason to talk to you. Eleanor felt her heart race. That is quite a confession. I believe in honesty, Yates said simply. I have seen too many people dance around the truth, waste precious time pretending to be something they are not or to feel something they do not. Life is too short and too uncertain for such games. I appreciate your directness, Eleanor said, trying to match his candor. And if I am being equally honest, I am very glad you approached me, whatever your initial motivation. Glad enough to see me again tomorrow, he asked. Yes, she said without hesitation. Though I should warn you that I help my aunt in the store during the day, my free time is limited. I could come by the store, Yates suggested. Perhaps help with any heavy lifting your aunt needs done. I am good with my hands and I hate being idle. And so began a pattern that continued throughout the week. Yates would appear at the general store mid-morning, cheerfully offering to help with whatever tasks needed doing. He moved heavy crates with ease, made repairs to shelving that had been sagging for months, even helped reorganize the storeroom in a way that made much more sense than the previous system. Martha watched this with obvious amusement, but also approval, particularly when Yates refused to accept payment for his labor. Your hospitality and conversation are payment enough, he told her when she tried to press coins into his hand. Besides, it gives me an excuse to spend time with your niece, which is worth far more than money. During breaks and in the quieter moments of the day, Yates and Eleanor would sit on the porch of the store and talk. They discussed books they had read, dreams they harbored, observations about human nature and the world around them. Eleanor found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. Her frustration with the limited roles available to women, her secret hope of one day publishing a novel, her fear that she was too independent and opinionated to ever find a man who would accept her as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. Yates listened to all of this without judgment, nodding thoughtfully and asking questions that showed he was truly hearing her. I do not see why wanting to use your talents and intelligence makes you unsuitable for marriage, he said at one point. If anything, it seems like those qualities would make you a far more interesting and valuable partner. Any man who feels threatened by a woman's capabilities is showing his own weakness, not hers. Words like that, spoken with such conviction, made Eleanor's defenses crumble a little more each day. She had built walls around her heart after the disaster with Robert, determined not to let herself be vulnerable to that kind of disappointment again. But Yates seemed to slip past those walls without even trying, simply by being genuine and kind and utterly himself. On Wednesday evening, Yates invited Eleanor to walk with him after the store closed. They strolled through the town as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. He told her about his brother Samuel, who had stayed on the family ranch in Texas and was working to expand it into something profitable. Samuel always knew what he wanted, Yates said. From the time he was small, he loved that land and those cattle. It made sense for him to stay, to carry on what our parents started. But I felt something pulling me elsewhere, a need to see what was beyond the horizon. At first, I thought I was running away from grief, but over time I realized I was running towards something, though I could not say exactly what. "Have you found it yet?" Eleanor asked. Whatever you were running toward, Yates stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "I think perhaps I have," he said quietly, "though it is not at all what I expected to find." They were standing at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open grassland and the distant line of mountains. The evening air was cooling, carrying the scent of sagebrush and wildflowers. Eleanor felt suspended in the moment, aware that something significant was happening but uncertain how to respond. "Eleanor," Yates said, using her first name for the first time without the formal miss. "I know we have only known each other for a few days, but I feel more connected to you than I have felt to anyone in years, maybe ever. I find myself thinking about you constantly, wanting to know what you think about everything, wanting to share every experience with you. Is that crazy?" "If it is, then I am equally crazy," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have felt the same way. It frightens me a bit, to be honest. How can something so significant happen so quickly?" "I do not know," Yates said, reaching out to take her hand. His touch sent warmth flooding through her. "But I trust what I feel. I have learned to recognize truth when I encounter it, and this feels true. More true than anything has in a very long time." "What do we do about it?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "We see where it leads," Yates said simply. "I was supposed to move on with the horses in a few days, but I am thinking of sending my men ahead with the herd and staying here a while longer. I want more time with you. I want to see if this feeling continues to grow or if it is just the intensity of a new connection that will fade with familiarity." "And if it grows," Eleanor asked, her heart pounding, "then we figure out what comes next," Yates said. "Together." That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal until her candle burned low, trying to capture the confusion of emotions swirling through her. Joy and fear seemed tangled together, hope and uncertainty dancing in circles around each other. She wanted to trust what she felt, wanted to believe that Yates was different from Robert, that this connection was real and lasting. But she had been wrong before, had invested her heart in someone who ultimately wanted to reshape her into something more convenient. The difference, she realized as she finally set down her pen, was that Yates seemed to appreciate her exactly as she was. He did not try to moderate her opinions or suggest that her ambitions were inappropriate. When she spoke passionately about social justice or literary theory or her frustration with societal constraints, he engaged with her ideas rather than dismissing them. He challenged her thinking sometimes, offering different perspectives, but always with respect for her intelligence and right to her own views. Could it really be this simple? Could love be found in shared conversations and mutual respect, in the pleasure of discovering someone whose mind worked in harmony with your own? Eleanor had always been told that love was about compromise and submission, about finding someone who could provide for you and protect you in exchange for your obedience and domesticity. But what she felt with Yates seemed to be about expansion rather than contraction, about becoming more fully yourself rather than less. True to his word, Yates sent his men north with the horses that Friday morning, staying behind in Wasco. He rented a room at the boarding house and took on some temporary work helping to build a new barn for one of the local ranchers. In the evenings and on Eleanor's free afternoons, they continued to spend time together, their conversations deepening as they shared more of their histories and hopes. Eleanor told him about her childhood, about a mother who had wanted her to be more conventional and a father who had encouraged her love of reading even as he despaired of her ever finding a suitable husband. She described the intellectual loneliness of growing up in a world where most women her age seemed content with concerns she found trivial, and the brief joy of finding like-minded friends during a year she spent at a female academy before family finances forced her to return home. Yates shared stories about his years of wandering, about the characters he had met, and the lessons he had learned. He spoke of a winter spent in a mining camp where he had nearly died of pneumonia, saved by a Chinese doctor whose methods were strange but effective. He described witnessing a gunfight in Tombstone that had left him shaken by the casual brutality of violence, and helping a family of homesteaders through a hard winter when their crops had failed and their supplies had run out. "I have seen humanity at its worst and at its best," he reflected during one of their conversations. "I have met people who would kill you for the boots on your feet and people who would give you their last piece of bread without expecting anything in return. I have learned that social position and wealth have very little to do with a person's true character. Some of the finest people I have known could not read or write, and some of the most despicable had been to the best schools and wore expensive clothes." "That is a very democratic philosophy," Eleanor observed. "I suppose it is," Yates agreed. "This country is supposed to be about equality and opportunity, but we fall so far short of those ideals. The way we have treated the native peoples, the continuation of racial prejudice even after slavery ended, the assumption that women are somehow lesser beings who need to be controlled and protected. It all seems fundamentally at odds with the principles we claim to hold dear." These kinds of conversations only deepened Eleanor's growing feelings for Yates. It was one thing to find a man attractive, another to enjoy his company, but something else entirely to discover that his values aligned with your own in fundamental ways. She had almost given up hope of finding someone who saw the world similarly, who questioned injustice rather than accepting it, who believed in the possibility of a better and more equitable society. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Yates took Eleanor on a picnic to a beautiful spot along the creek that ran a few miles outside of town. He had borrowed a horse and wagon from his employer, and they drove out in the late afternoon, the summer day still warm but losing some of its fierce heat. He had packed food from the hotel dining room: fried chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and apple pie. There was even a bottle of wine, which made Eleanor laugh. "This is quite elaborate," she said as he spread out a blanket near the water's edge. "Are you trying to impress me, Mr. Turner?" "Absolutely," he said with a grin. "Is it working?" "Perhaps," she teased, settling onto the blanket. They ate slowly, talking and laughing, watching the water flow past. The creek was not large, but it was clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains. Trees grew along its banks, creating a canopy of green that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns. It felt like a world apart from the dusty streets of Wasco, a private paradise where only they existed. After they finished eating, Yates produced the volume of Whitman poetry that Eleanor had lent him weeks ago. "I want to read you something," he said, opening to a page he had marked. "If you do not mind, please," Eleanor said, curious about which poem he had chosen. His voice was low and resonant as he read. "I am he that aches with amorous love. Does the earth gravitate? Does not all matter, aching, attract all matter, so the body of me to all I meet or know?" He paused, looking up to meet her eyes before continuing. "I merely stir, press, feel with my fingers, and am happy. To touch my person to someone else's is about as much as I can stand." The intimacy of the words, combined with the intensity of his gaze, made Eleanor's breath catch. She understood what he was saying without him having to spell it out, the way poetry could express feelings that ordinary language struggled to capture. "Eleanor," Yates said, setting the book aside and moving closer to her. "I need to tell you something, and I am just going to say it plainly because I am not good at dancing around the truth. I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have already fallen. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I cannot deny what I feel. You are everything I did not know I was looking for. Your intelligence, your passion, your kindness, your courage in being exactly who you are without apology. I think about you constantly. I dream about building a life with you." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. "I am falling in love with you too," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I have been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but it is no use. You have completely captured my heart, Yates Turner." He reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had escaped. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. "Yes," she whispered. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if they were both aware of the significance of the moment. But then it deepened, becoming more passionate as weeks of growing desire found expression. Eleanor felt herself responding in ways she never had with Robert, whose kisses had always felt somewhat dutiful and uninspiring. This was different. This was fire and tenderness combined, need and care intertwined. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is soon. I know I should probably wait and court you properly, but I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Marry me, Eleanor. Be my wife, my partner, my companion in all things." Eleanor's practical mind told her this was reckless, that she should wait, that she barely knew this man despite the intensity of their connection. But her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, was singing a different song. She thought about the conversations that had spanned hours without either of them noticing time passing. She thought about the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious and powerful at the same time. She thought about the values they shared, the dreams that seemed to align, the feeling of being truly seen and accepted for who she was. "Yes," she said, and then more firmly, "Yes, I will marry you." The joy on his face was incandescent. He kissed her again, and then they were both laughing, giddy with happiness and the enormity of what they had just decided. They stayed by the creek until the sun began to set, making plans and dreaming out loud about their future together. Yates told her about a piece of land he had been eyeing in eastern Oregon, near the Blue Mountains. It was good grazing country with water access, perfect for raising horses, which was what he knew best. He had almost enough saved to make a down payment, and with both of them working hard, they could build something substantial over time. "I want you to continue writing," he said firmly. "In fact, I insist on it. You have too much talent to let it go to waste. We will figure out a way to make time for your work alongside everything else. And who knows, maybe someday we will see your name on the cover of a published book." Eleanor felt a surge of love so strong it almost overwhelmed her. This was what partnership could be, what marriage should be. Not one person sacrificing their dreams for the other, but both people supporting each other in becoming the fullest versions of themselves. They returned to town as darkness fell, both knowing they needed to tell Martha and make proper plans. Eleanor was slightly nervous about her aunt's reaction, given how quickly this was all happening, but Yates seemed completely confident. Martha was waiting up when they arrived, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch of the store. She took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "So," she said, "I assume this evening went well." "Aunt Martha," Eleanor said, sitting down beside her aunt while Yates stood respectfully at the base of the porch steps. "Yates has asked me to marry him, and I have accepted. I know it seems sudden, but I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in my life." Martha looked at Yates for a long moment, her expression serious. "You understand that my niece is special, that she has a mind and spirit that would wither under the wrong circumstances, that she needs a partner who will nurture her gifts rather than trying to constrain them." "I do understand that, madam," Yates said steadily. "And I give you my word that I will spend my life supporting Eleanor in being exactly who she is meant to be. I love her intelligence and her independence. I would never try to diminish those qualities." "Can you provide for her?" Martha asked. "I am not talking about wealth, but about basic security and comfort." "I have savings that will allow us to buy land and stock it," Yates replied. "I am not afraid of hard work, and I have skills that are valued. We will not have an easy life, especially at first, but we will have enough. And more importantly, we will have each other." Martha stood and walked down the steps, looking Yates up and down with an assessing gaze. Then, to Eleanor's relief, her face broke into a warm smile. "Well then, I suppose we should start planning a wedding. When were you thinking?" Eleanor and Yates looked at each other. "Soon," Eleanor said. "We see no point in a long engagement, perhaps a month from now. That would give us time to make arrangements, but not so long that we are simply waiting unnecessarily." "A month it is," Martha agreed, "though you realize this means I am losing my helper at the store." "Actually," Yates said, "I was hoping we might be able to stay in the area for a while after the wedding. I have been talking with some of the local ranchers, and there is good work available. We could save more money for our own place while Eleanor continues to help you if she wants to. I would not want to take her away from you abruptly." This thoughtfulness seemed to win Martha over completely. She embraced Yates warmly and then pulled Eleanor into a tight hug. "Your mother would have had mixed feelings about this," she said quietly, "but I think you are making the right choice. He is a good man, and the two of you fit together in a way that matters." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Eleanor sewed a simple but elegant wedding dress from cream-colored fabric that Martha insisted on purchasing as her gift. Yates worked extra hours to add to their savings and made arrangements for them to rent a small house on the outskirts of town. They would live there while he worked for the local ranchers, and they built up their resources for the eventual move to their own land. The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon in late August, just over a month after they had first met beneath the oak tree. It was a small ceremony held in the town's modest church, attended by Martha, a few of Eleanor's friends from the town, and several of Yates's cowboy friends who had traveled back from various jobs to witness his marriage. The minister who performed the service was slightly scandalized by how quickly the courtship had progressed, but he had to admit that he had rarely seen two people more clearly devoted to each other. Eleanor wore wildflowers in her hair and carried a simple bouquet of the same blooms. Yates wore his best clothes, cleaned and pressed, his hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaved. When he saw Eleanor walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears that he did not bother to hide. They spoke traditional vows, but afterward, they had also prepared personal promises to share with each other. Eleanor went first, her voice steady despite her nervousness at speaking in front of the small crowd. Yates, I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as you support mine, to meet life's challenges with courage and its joys with gratitude. I promise to be honest with you always, to share my thoughts and feelings even when they are difficult. I promise to love you not just in the easy times but through whatever hardships we may face. And I promise to never stop being amazed that I found someone who sees me, truly sees me, and loves what he sees. There were sniffles from several of the women in attendance, and even some of the rough cowboys looked suspiciously misty-eyed. Yates took her hands in his grip firm and warm. Eleanor, I promise to cherish your independence and celebrate your strength. I promise to be a partner, not a master, to seek your counsel and respect your wisdom. I promise to protect what we build together and to always make you feel safe to be your authentic self. I promise to read with you, dream with you, and grow old with you. And I promise that every single day, I will remember how blessed I am that you were sitting under a tree reading when I happened to pass by. The kiss they shared after being pronounced husband and wife was met with cheers and applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was the beginning of the life she was meant to live, with the person she was meant to love. The reception was held at the town's largest saloon, which had been temporarily transformed into something more respectable for the occasion. Tables had been set up with food contributed by various townspeople, and someone had even brought a fiddle to provide music. Eleanor danced with Yates, with several of his friends, and even with old Mr. Peterson from the hardware store who was surprisingly spry for his age. As the evening wore on, and the celebration continued around them, Yates pulled Eleanor outside into the cooler night air. They stood together in the street, the sounds of music and laughter drifting out from the saloon, the stars brilliant overhead. "Are you happy?" Yates asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be," she said honestly. "Though I confess I am also a bit nervous about what comes next. The wedding night," he asked gently. "That and everything else. Building a life together, the daily reality of marriage after the romance of courtship. What if we discover we are not as compatible as we think?" Yates turned her around to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Then we will work through it," he said simply. "Eleanor, I am not naive enough to think marriage will always be easy or that we will never disagree or frustrate each other. We are both strong-willed people with our own ideas and opinions, but I believe that what we have is strong enough to weather whatever comes. We respect each other, we genuinely like each other, and we are committed to the same fundamental values. That is a better foundation than most marriages have." "You are right," Eleanor said, feeling her nervousness ease. "I suppose I am just not used to things working out the way I hoped. It makes me wait for the other shoe to drop." "No shoes dropping tonight," Yates promised, leaning down to kiss her softly. "Just you and me beginning our adventure together." They walked to their rented house, a small but tidy building that Yates had already furnished with basic necessities. He had even, Eleanor discovered with delight, installed bookshelves in the main room and purchased several new volumes to start their married library. "I know we need to be careful with money," he said, watching her examine the books, "but I thought we should start our collection properly. These are wedding gifts from me to us." The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery, but also of deep contentment. They fell into routines that suited them both. Yates would leave early for his work at the ranches, returning in the evening tired but satisfied. Eleanor continued to help Martha at the store several days a week, and on her free days, she wrote. She started working on a novel, a story set in the West about a woman who defied convention to build her own life. It poured out of her with an ease she had never experienced before, as if getting married had unlocked something creative that had been dammed up inside her. In the evenings, she would read passages aloud to Yates, and he would offer thoughtful feedback and encouragement. He never dismissed her work as a mere hobby, or suggested that she should be spending her time on more domestic pursuits. Instead, he protected that writing time fiercely, taking on extra household chores so she would have the freedom to create. They also read together, working their way through books they had not yet shared, discussing and debating late into the night. These conversations were some of Eleanor's favorite times, the intellectual intimacy as satisfying as the physical intimacy they had discovered together. Yates was a generous and patient lover, as attentive to her pleasure as to his own, and Eleanor found herself grateful for his experience even as she was glad to be learning this aspect of life with someone who genuinely cared for her. As autumn arrived and the weather began to cool, Yates started having serious conversations with ranchers in the area about the land market. He learned that a property near the Blue Mountains was becoming available, a homestead whose owner had decided to return east after his wife died. It was not large, but it had water, good grass, and enough timber for building. The price was reasonable, within reach of their combined savings. "What do you think?" Yates asked Eleanor, spreading out a rough map on their kitchen table. "It would mean leaving Wasco, leaving your aunt, starting completely fresh in a less settled area. It would be hard work and probably years before we could afford to hire help. Are you willing to take that on?" Eleanor studied the map, thinking about what he was asking. It would indeed be a challenging life, much more primitive than what she was used to even in Wasco. But it would also be theirs, a place they built together from the ground up. And she would still be able to write, perhaps even more freely without the distractions and obligations of town life. "I think we should do it," she said. "But I want to make one request. Let me finish my novel first. I am close to the end and I want to complete it before we move. I may not have time for sustained writing during the first year of establishing the ranch." "That seems more than reasonable," Yates agreed. "We probably should not move until spring anyway, when the weather is better for building and the land is ready for planting. That gives you several months to finish." They talked long into the night about their plans and dreams. Yates wanted to focus on breeding quality horses, developing a reputation for sound animals that could be sold for good prices. Eleanor wanted to try keeping chickens and perhaps a milk cow, to have a large garden, and to make their home a place of beauty despite its rustic setting. They both wanted children eventually, though they agreed to wait a few years until the ranch was more established. "I want our children to grow up with books and music and ideas," Eleanor said, "but also with an understanding of how to work hard and build something lasting. I want them to see their mother and father as equal partners who respect and support each other." "Then that is exactly what we will show them," Yates promised. Winter in Oregon Territory could be harsh, and that year was no exception. The house they rented was drafty, and keeping it warm required constant attention to the fire. But Eleanor found a kind of coziness in those long winter evenings, sitting close to Yates on the old sofa they had purchased secondhand, both of them reading by lamplight while wind howled outside. Sometimes they would read aloud to each other, taking turns with a novel or sharing particularly striking passages from whatever they were studying. Eleanor finished her novel in February, writing the last words with a mixture of triumph and sadness. Yates insisted they celebrate, taking her to the nicest restaurant in Wasco for dinner. Over the meal, he asked what she planned to do with the manuscript. "I am not sure," Eleanor admitted. "Part of me wants to try sending it to publishers in New York or Boston, but another part is terrified of rejection. What if it is not actually any good? What if I have been deluding myself about my talent? What if it is brilliant and you never know because you were too afraid to try?" Yates countered gently. "Eleanor, you are one of the bravest people I know in every other area of your life. Why not be equally brave about your writing?" His words struck home. She had taken enormous risks in marrying him so quickly, in preparing to move to an isolated ranch, in defying conventional expectations for how a woman should live. Why should pursuing publication be any different? "You are right," she said. "I will prepare it properly and send it out. The worst that can happen is rejection, and I have survived that before." "That is my girl," Yates said with a proud smile. In March, as the weather began to warm and the first signs of spring appeared, they made their final preparations for the move. The purchase of the land went through without complications, and Yates arranged for a wagon to transport their belongings. Martha was sad to see Eleanor go, but supportive of the decision, recognizing that her niece needed to follow her own path. "You write to me," Martha instructed firmly as they said their goodbyes. "I want to know how you are doing, what your life is like out there. And if you ever need anything, if things get too hard, you come back here. You will always have a home with me." "Thank you, Aunt Martha," Eleanor said, embracing her aunt tightly, "for everything. For giving me a place to land when I needed it, for accepting Yates, for understanding what I need to be happy." "You deserve happiness, child," Martha said, her eyes damp. "You have always deserved it. I am just glad you found someone who recognizes your worth." The journey to their new property took 2 days, camping overnight along the way. When they finally arrived, Eleanor felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The land was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, with mountains rising in the distance and a small creek running through the property. But the house, such as it was, needed significant work. The previous owner had built a rough cabin that was structurally sound but minimal in every other way. "We will make it better," Yates promised, seeing Eleanor's expression as she surveyed their new home. "I am good with carpentry, and we have time before winter to make real improvements. By this time next year, you will not recognize the place." They set to work immediately, falling into a routine of hard physical labor that left them exhausted each night, but also satisfied. Yates worked on expanding and improving the cabin while also beginning to fence pasture areas for the horses he planned to acquire. Eleanor established a garden, set up a chicken coop, using materials they had brought, and organized the interior of the cabin to make it as comfortable as possible. The isolation was sometimes challenging. Their nearest neighbors were several miles away, and trips to the closest town for supplies took most of a day. But Eleanor also found a freedom in the solitude that she had never experienced before. She could write in the middle of the day if inspiration struck, could go for long walks without worrying about propriety, could be completely herself without any social constraints. Yates proved to be as good a partner in this new venture as he had been in everything else. He consulted her on major decisions, valued her opinions about how to develop the ranch, and insisted that her writing time remain protected even when there was more work than they could easily handle. When a neighboring rancher made a comment about Eleanor being uppity because she was educated and opinionated, Yates calmly informed the man that his wife's intelligence was one of the things he valued most about her and that any disrespect toward her would not be tolerated. The first horses arrived in late spring, a small herd that Yates had purchased from a breeder in Idaho Territory. He had a good eye for animals, selecting stock that showed both strength and temperament. Eleanor watched him work with the horses and saw the same patience and gentleness he showed with her. The ability to be firm without being harsh, to command respect without using fear. By their first anniversary, the ranch was beginning to take shape. The cabin now had 2 proper rooms plus a small loft, a covered porch, and windows that actually kept out the weather. The fences were up, the garden was producing abundantly, and the small herd of horses was thriving. Eleanor had established a routine of writing every morning while Yates did the early ranch chores, then helping with other tasks in the afternoon. They celebrated their anniversary with a special dinner that Eleanor prepared, using vegetables from her garden and a chicken she had raised herself. Yates gave her a beautiful leather-bound journal for her writing, and she gave him a warm coat she had sewn over the winter months. But more than the gifts, they celebrated how far they had come, how much they had built together in just 1 year. "I love you more now than I did when we married," Yates said as they sat on their porch watching the sun set. "I did not think that was possible, but knowing you more deeply has only increased my appreciation for who you are." "I feel the same," Eleanor said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "This life is hard sometimes, but it is ours. We are building something real and lasting, something that reflects both of us." That fall, Eleanor received a letter that made her hands shake as she opened it. She had sent her manuscript to 3 different publishers in the East, expecting nothing but hoping nonetheless. 2 had already sent polite rejections, but this 3rd letter was different. A publishing house in Boston was interested in her novel. They wanted to make some edits, but they believed it had potential and were offering her a contract. When Yates came in from working with the horses, he found Eleanor sitting at the table, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the letter. For a moment his heart stopped, fearing bad news from Massachusetts. But then she looked up at him with a radiant smile. "They want to publish it," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "They actually want to publish my book." Yates let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the small cabin. "I knew it," he said, setting her down and kissing her soundly. "I knew you had real talent. This is just the beginning, Eleanor, I can feel it." The process of working with the publisher took several months, with letters going back and forth about edits and revisions. Eleanor threw herself into the work with intense focus, determined to make the book the best it could be. Yates supported her completely, taking on extra ranch duties so she could concentrate on the manuscript. The book was published the following spring under the title Wilderness Hearts, with Eleanor's name prominently on the cover. It was not a huge success by any means, but it received respectful reviews and sold well enough that the publisher asked if she had another novel in the works. Eleanor did, a story she had been developing during her spare moments, and she set to work on it with renewed confidence. As their 2nd year on the ranch progressed, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news brought both joy and some anxiety. She worried about how she would manage writing alongside motherhood, and about the practical challenges of having a baby in such an isolated location. But Yates was over the moon with happiness, his excitement contagious. "We will figure it out together," he assured her. "Just like we have figured out everything else. And Eleanor, you do not have to choose between being a mother and being a writer. You can be both. We will make it work." He was true to his word. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, Yates made improvements to the cabin to accommodate a child, building a cradle from pine wood and ensuring their home was as safe and comfortable as possible. He also made arrangements with a midwife in the nearest town to come stay with them when Eleanor's time drew near. Their son was born in late winter, arriving during a snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin for several days afterward. The birth was difficult, and there were moments when Eleanor was genuinely frightened, but the midwife was experienced and capable. When she finally held her baby, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and lungs that proclaimed his vigor to the world, Eleanor felt a rush of love unlike anything she had ever experienced. They named him William, after Yates's father. William Turner grew quickly, proving to be a curious and active child who kept both his parents busy. Eleanor discovered that motherhood was both harder and more rewarding than she had imagined. The lack of sleep was brutal, the constant demands exhausting. But watching her son discover the world, seeing him respond to stories and songs, feeling the absolute trust of his small hand in hers, filled her with a profound sense of purpose. And she did continue to write, though the process looked different now. She wrote during William's naps in the early mornings before he woke, in stolen moments throughout the day. The words came more slowly, but they still came. Her second novel was published when William was 18 months old, and while she could not devote as much time to promotion and correspondence with her publisher as she might have liked, the work itself was perhaps deeper and richer for the changes in her life. The ranch continued to prosper as well. Yates had developed a reputation for breeding excellent horses, and buyers came from across Oregon Territory and beyond to purchase his stock. They were able to hire help during the busiest seasons, giving them more flexibility and reducing the grinding nature of the constant work. They built a proper barn, expanded the cabin again to include a separate room for William, and made countless other improvements. When William was 3, Eleanor found herself pregnant again. This time she felt more confident about managing both motherhood and her other responsibilities, though she was still nervous about the birth itself. Their second child was a daughter, born easily on a beautiful spring morning. They named her Martha, after Eleanor's aunt, and the baby seemed to bring nothing but joy from her first breath. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. William grew into a thoughtful, bookish child who loved hearing stories and learning to read. Martha was more adventurous, constantly exploring and getting into mischief. Eleanor published 3 more novels over the next decade, each one building on the modest success of the previous work. She never became famous, but she developed a loyal readership and the satisfaction of knowing that her words touched people's lives. Yates expanded the ranch steadily, bringing on permanent hired hands and eventually buying adjacent land when it became available. He took pride in running an operation known for both quality animals and fair treatment of workers. He and Eleanor made sure that anyone working for them was paid decent wages and provided with good housing, going against the common practice of squeezing every possible penny from hired help. As their children grew, Eleanor and Yates made sure to instill in them the values they both held dear. They taught William and Martha to read and think critically, to question injustice, to treat all people with respect regardless of social position. They wanted their children to appreciate education while also understanding the dignity of physical work, to be comfortable in the wilderness while also appreciating culture and art. On Sunday afternoons, when the weather permitted, the family would often go to the big oak tree that grew near the creek on their property. It had become a tradition, a way of honoring the tree where Eleanor and Yates had first met. They would spread a blanket and read together, just as Eleanor and Yates had done in those early days of courtship. William and Martha would sometimes act out scenes from the books, their imagination turning the landscape around them into whatever setting the story required. "This is what I dreamed of," Eleanor told Yates one such afternoon, watching their children play while the sun filtered through the oak's leaves. "Not exactly this, because I could not have imagined the specific details. But this feeling of wholeness, of building a life that honors all the different parts of who I am. Mother, wife, writer, rancher, friend. I do not have to choose or diminish any aspect of myself. I can be all of it. You have given me the same gift, Yates said, taking her hand. I was just wandering before I met you, doing work I enjoyed but not building toward anything meaningful. You gave me purpose and partnership and a reason to put down roots. I have never regretted stopping to ask what you were reading that day. It was the best decision I ever made. Eleanor laughed, remembering. You were so bold, just walking up to a strange woman and striking up a conversation. What if I had told you to go away? Then I would have missed out on the greatest blessing of my life, Yates said seriously. But I do not think you would have. There was something in the way you looked up at me that day, a kind of openness and interest. I felt it immediately, that sense of recognition, as if some part of me had been waiting to find some part of you. I felt it too, Eleanor admitted. It terrified me at first, how quickly and how deeply I was drawn to you. I tried to be sensible and cautious, but my heart would not listen to reason. Thank goodness for that, Yates said, leaning over to kiss her. Gross, William called from where he and Martha were playing. Stop kissing and come help us build a fort. Both parents laughed and went to join their children, who had decided the oak tree would serve as the center of their elaborate construction. The afternoon dissolved into play and laughter, the kind of ordinary magic that made up a life well lived. As the years continued to pass, Eleanor and Yates faced their share of challenges. There were harsh winters that tested their resources, dry summers that stressed the land, economic downturns that made selling horses difficult. Martha went through a rebellious phase in her teenage years, questioning everything and pushing boundaries in ways that worried her parents. William struggled with feeling pressure to take over the ranch when he was more interested in pursuing law. There were illnesses, accidents, disappointments, and sorrows. But through all of it, Eleanor and Yates maintained the partnership they had forged in those early days. They talked through problems, supported each other through difficulties, and never lost sight of the love and respect that formed the foundation of their relationship. They continued to read together, to discuss ideas, to challenge and inspire each other. Eleanor published her 10th novel when she was 45, a milestone that made her reflect on how much her life had exceeded her youthful dreams. She had created a body of work she was proud of, raised 2 children who were becoming thoughtful and capable adults, built a successful ranch with her husband, and maintained her sense of self through all of it. Not every day had been easy, but every day had been hers, lived on her own terms. Yates, watching her at the celebration they held for the publication, felt his heart swell with pride and love. She was 50 now, but still as beautiful to him as she had been at 23. The lines on her face told the story of their life together, marked by laughter and concentration, worry and joy. Her hair held more silver than brown now, but her eyes still sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, catching him staring. "How blessed I am," he said simply. "How grateful I am for every day with you. Even the hard days," she teased. "Especially the hard days," he said seriously. "Those are the ones that prove what we have is real and lasting. Anyone can be happy together when things are easy. It is weathering the storms together that builds true intimacy." Martha, now 22 and recently engaged to a teacher from the nearest town, overheard this exchange. "I want what you and Papa have," she told her mother later that evening as they cleaned up after the party. "The way you respect each other, the way you are still clearly in love after all these years. I will not settle for anything less." "Good," Eleanor said firmly. "Never settle, Martha." Wait for someone who sees all of you and loves all of you, who wants to build something together rather than have you simply fit into their pre-existing life. Like Papa did with you, Martha said. Like your father and I did with each other, Eleanor corrected gently. It was not him rescuing me or me completing him. It was two whole people choosing to join their lives while remaining individuals. William, overhearing from the next room, smiled to himself. His parents had given him and Martha an incredible gift, modeling what a marriage based on equality and mutual respect could look like. He knew that not everyone had been so fortunate in their upbringing. The years continued their steady march. William did pursue law, becoming an attorney who specialized in land rights and working to protect small ranchers from being pushed out by larger operations. He married a woman he met at university, a suffragist named Clara, who reminded everyone of Eleanor with her intelligence and passion for justice. Martha married her teacher, and they settled in a nearby town, where she worked alongside her husband in educating children and advocating for improved schools. Eleanor and Yates became grandparents, delighting in the role while also appreciating that they could hand the children back at the end of the day. The ranch was now primarily run by a capable foreman, though Yates still involved himself in the major decisions, and Eleanor still kept the books and managed the business side. This gave them more time to travel a bit, to visit their children and grandchildren, to simply enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. On their 30th anniversary, they returned to Wasco for the first time in many years. The town had grown considerably, now boasting a proper hotel, several churches, and even a small library. Martha Crawford had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving the general store to a nephew, but her presence was still remembered fondly by the older residents. Eleanor and Yates walked through the town together, marveling at the changes while also feeling the weight of memory. They made their way to the edge of town where the old oak tree still stood, though it was now surrounded by houses rather than open grassland. "Should we sit?" Yates asked, gesturing to the tree. "I would like that," Eleanor said. They settled on the grass beneath the spreading branches, and Eleanor pulled a book from her bag. It was a worn copy of Great Expectations, the same volume she had been reading that day 30 years ago when a cowboy had stopped to ask what she was reading. "Shall I read to you?" she asked. "Please," Yates said, settling back against the trunk exactly as he had done all those years ago. Eleanor opened the book and began to read, her voice still clear and strong despite the passage of years. Yates listened with his eyes closed, transported back to that afternoon when they had talked for hours about literature and life, when they had discovered in each other something unexpected and precious. When she finished the passage, Eleanor closed the book and looked at her husband. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, about becoming someone better than you were without losing the essential parts of yourself?" "I remember every moment of that day," Yates said, opening his eyes to meet hers. "It was the day my real life began." "Mine too," Eleanor said softly. "Everything that came before was just preparation for meeting you, for building the life we have created together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the world go by. Eventually, a young woman walked past carrying a book, and she smiled at the sight of the elderly couple beneath the tree. "That is a good book," Eleanor called out, recognizing the title. The young woman stopped, her face lighting up. "It is wonderful. Have you read it?" "I wrote it," Eleanor said with a smile. The woman's eyes widened. "You are Eleanor Crawford Turner. Oh my goodness, I have read all your novels. They are my favorites. The way you write about women being strong and independent, about partnerships between equals, it has meant so much to me." Yates watched with pride as Eleanor talked with the young woman about writing and life and dreams. This happened occasionally now, Eleanor being recognized by readers who appreciated her work. It always touched him to see the impact her words had on people, the way her stories inspired others to live more authentically. After the young woman continued on her way, Eleanor turned back to Yates with tears in her eyes. "I never imagined this," she said. "That my words would reach people, that they would matter to anyone beyond myself." "I always knew," Yates said, pulling her close. "I knew from the very first conversation we had that you had something important to say. I am just grateful I got to be part of your journey, to support you in sharing your gifts with the world." They returned to their ranch the next day, back to the life they had built in the shadow of the Blue Mountains. The land had aged with them, the original cabin now surrounded by other buildings, the pastures well established and productive. It was not the wild, untamed place it had been when they first arrived, but it was theirs, marked by decades of their labor and love. As they grew older, Eleanor and Yates settled into the rhythms of their later years. There were grandchildren to spoil and eventually great-grandchildren. There were books to read and stories to share. Eleanor continued to write, though more slowly now, her hands sometimes stiff with age. Yates spent his days working with the horses, his movements more careful but his skill undiminished. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by family and friends, a gathering that brought people from across Oregon and beyond. William gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes, speaking of his parents' enduring love and the example they had set for all who knew them. "They showed us that love is not just a feeling but a choice made every day," he said. "A choice to respect, to support, to see the best in each other even during difficult times. They showed us that two people can join their lives without losing themselves, can build something together that is greater than either could achieve alone. And they showed us that romance does not fade with time but deepens, becoming something richer and more complex than the initial spark of attraction." Eleanor, sitting beside Yates at the head of the table, squeezed his hand. He lifted it to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture he had made countless times over their 50 years together, but that still made her heart flutter. "I would do it all again," he whispered to her. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it as long as it was with you." "As would I," Eleanor whispered back. "You are my greatest adventure, Yates Turner. You always have been." The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Yates's health began to decline, his body finally showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor. Eleanor cared for him with the same devotion he had always shown her, reading to him when he was too tired to hold a book himself, sitting beside him for hours just holding his hand. On a warm spring evening when Yates was 78 and Eleanor 74, they sat together on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The land spread out before them, beautiful and familiar, marked by their years of stewardship. "It has been a good life," Yates said, his voice weaker than it once had been but still warm with contentment. "The best life," Eleanor agreed, her head resting on his shoulder. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "How could I regret anything when it all led me to you, to this, to the family we created and the legacy we are leaving?" Yates was quiet for a moment, then said, "When I am gone, I want you to keep writing. Promise me you will keep writing, Eleanor. The world needs your words." "Do not talk about being gone," Eleanor said, though she knew they needed to have this conversation. "You are not going anywhere for a long time yet." "We both know that is not true," Yates said gently, "and that is all right. I have lived a full and happy life. I got to love you and be loved by you for 53 years. I got to raise children and build something lasting. I got to read beautiful books and have meaningful conversations and sleep under the stars. What more could any man ask for? Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I do not know how to exist without you. The same way you existed before me, Yates said. As a strong, capable, brilliant woman with so much still to give to the world, I will just be somewhere you cannot see me for a while, cheering you on as I always have. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, Eleanor beside him holding his hand. The grief was profound, a physical pain that seemed to hollow out her chest and make breathing difficult. But even in her sorrow, Eleanor felt grateful. Grateful for every day they had shared, every conversation and kiss and quiet moment. Grateful that he had not suffered long, that he had remained himself until the very end. Grateful for the family they had built and the love that would continue long after his death. She kept her promise to him and continued writing, producing 2 more novels in the years after his death. The writing was different now, infused with a deeper understanding of love and loss, of the preciousness of time and the importance of living fully while you can. Critics noted a new depth and poignancy in her work, though Eleanor herself could not judge. She wrote because Yates had asked her to, because the words still came, because it was how she made sense of the world. Eleanor lived another 12 years after Yates died, years filled with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with her writing and her garden and her memories. She never remarried, though there were offers. How could anyone compare to what she had experienced with Yates? Their partnership had been a once-in-a-lifetime gift, and she was content to live with the memory of it rather than trying to replace it. On a summer afternoon just weeks before her 86th birthday, Eleanor's granddaughter found her sitting beneath an oak tree on the ranch property, a book in her lap and a peaceful expression on her face. She had passed away quietly, slipping from one world to the next as gently as turning a page. The book in her lap was Great Expectations, worn and beloved, the same copy she had been reading that day when a cowboy had stopped to ask about it and stayed for hours. At Eleanor's funeral, William read from one of her novels, a passage about the enduring nature of true love. Martha shared stories about her parents' partnership and the example they had set. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren spoke of her wisdom, her kindness, her insistence that they pursue their dreams fearlessly. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. The young woman who had met Eleanor beneath the oak tree in Wasco had gone on to become a writer herself, inspired by Eleanor's example. She had written an essay about meeting her literary hero, about the love she witnessed between Eleanor and Yates that day, about how their story had shaped her own understanding of what was possible in life and love. The essay was read at the funeral, and there was not a dry eye in the crowd when it concluded. Eleanor Crawford Turner showed us that love is not about losing yourself in another person, but about becoming more fully yourself in their presence. She showed us that romance and partnership can coexist with independence and ambition. She showed us that a chance encounter beneath a tree can change the entire trajectory of a life. And she showed us that the greatest stories are not always found in books, but in the way we choose to live our lives, the connections we make, and the love we dare to embrace. Eleanor was buried beside Yates on the ranch they had built together, beneath the wide Oregon sky they had both loved. In the years that followed, their descendants continued to work the land and honor their memory. The ranch became known not just for quality horses, but as a place where strong partnerships were valued, where education and hard work went hand in hand, where love was understood as both a feeling and a choice. And sometimes, on quiet summer afternoons, if you walked to the old oak tree by the creek, You might see two figures sitting beneath its spreading branches. One would be reading aloud while the other listened with eyes closed and a gentle smile. They would seem as real as anything, these ghosts of memory, as solid as the love they had shared and the legacy they had left behind. The cowboy who had stopped to ask about a book and stayed not just for hours but for a lifetime, and the woman who had looked up from her reading to find the partner her soul had been seeking. Their story had ended, as all stories must, but the love they had built continued on, woven into the land and the family and the very air of the place they had made their own. It lived in the books Eleanor had written, in the values they had passed to their children, in the example they had set of what a true partnership could be. And it lived in the memory of that first afternoon, when a simple question about literature had opened the door to a lifetime of love.